Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. I also upload Technique Tuesday videos, which are strictly technique related. For both types of videos, I include links down in the video description that allow you to jump from one section of the video to another, so you can skip ahead or rewatch a particular section if you'd like. So this week I have a few textile tidbits, an update on Finish It February, a new project that I started this week and will be finishing in the next day or two. I want to update you on my Roaring 20s sweater project. And then I'm going to share with you a vintage knitting book that just popped into my mailbox this week. And I want to continue my discussion about vintage yarns and what I've been learning about those, because some of what I figured out last week turned out to be incorrect. So let's get started. So the first textile tidbit I have today is a bit of sad news. If you live here in the Twin Cities area, or maybe even anywhere in the upper Midwest, Detta of Detta Spindles died this past weekend. I just found out about it yesterday. I had been talking about her in my knitting group the day before, and what a wonderful time I had had when I was buying my spinning wheel when I was a brand new spinner. I'd gone to her home. She had her shop in the basement, and she had every kind of spinning wheel that I had been thinking I might want to buy. And she brought in others for me to compare them to. She was having so much fun watching me try out the wheels, and she was pulling fiber out of shelves and say, here, try this, here, try that. And she even would do spinning with dog fur and make yarn for people, and that would then get turned into little stuffed animals that would be remembrances of beloved pets. And she even mixed in some of her own poodles, furring with some yak and silk blend, and carded it up quickly for me, and then had me try spinning that out. I had such a wonderful time with her when I was buying my spinning wheel. And she gave me this huge hug at the end of it and said, "Oh, thank you so much for coming. I had the most delightful time." And so she had as good a time as I had. So just about every spinner I have talked to since I learned to spin has bought a wheel from Detta. Everybody knew who she was, and everybody bought a wheel from her. I believe her funeral is this afternoon, might be right now as I'm recording this. And I wish I could have been there, because she was really amazing. So that's just something I wanted to share in case any of you knew of Detta. So I follow this woman on Twitter. Her name, I'll put it here because I believe it's Dr. Kate Strasden, I think is her name. She is a fashion historian, and I just love seeing the tweets that she puts out every day. She posts at least one photo of some beautiful garment, historic garment. Sometimes it's from the 60s and sometimes it's from the 1700s. So they're just beautiful and really amazing. And she retweeted an announcement from the London Museum this couple of days ago that there will be an exhibition in September, starting in September, but reserve tickets started this week, I believe, or last week. The exhibition is on executions, so there'll be a wide range of artifacts that they will have on display, but the one that is of particular interest to me is they are going to have a knitted shirt, which they're calling a vest, meaning undershirt. That's the UK term for undershirt. It's long sleeves, but it's silk, and it's hand knit. And they have a photograph on the museum website, which I'll put down below. You cannot get a super zoomed in view, because I would love to be able to see how many stitches per inch that thing had, because I'm guessing it was probably about 20. I went to an exhibition here in the Twin Cities a couple of years ago. It was a traveling exhibition of artifacts related to Martin Luther, because the German Museum was preparing for the 300th, 400th anniversary of the Protestant Revolution. One of the items that they had on loan at our museum here in town was a glove. And I remember walking by it, and just like my spidey senses kind of were tingling, and I looked at it and I realized that it was a knitted glove. And it was a glove that was knitted before the purl stitch was invented. And it was a glove that the clergy would have, they would have washed their hands, and then they're like liturgical gloves, and then they would have taken them off. They weren't gloves people were wearing outside in the cold. Amazing. And I was looking at, how wide the fingers were and counting the number of stitches and thinking that is like 20 stitches per inch, and it was silk, and it also had all this elaborate embroidery on it. It was amazing. So my bet is that knitted shirt has a gauge that is similar. So it looks like it's probably a stranded colorwork pattern. It looks like they describe it as being blue-green. And so I'm not sure if both of the colors are blue-green or exactly what. But to me, that would be an amazing piece of knitting to be able to see. So if you are going to be in the London area in September, you might want to get tickets to go see that exhibition. I think it would be amazing to be able to see. I did leave the museum a comment that it would be really nice if it was a higher resolution photo so that knitters like me could be able to really look up closely. Because the thing is, even when that glove that I saw, even though I was able to be about this far away from it through the glass, is really hard to see with the glare of, of the lights reflecting off of the glass case and everything. And that shirt, I imagine, is going to be displayed in a way that you can't get super close to it as well. So it would be really nice to have a photograph that would allow you to really look it over inch by inch. A knitter can dream. So this week I went to the Machine Knitters Guild's monthly meeting because they were going to have a presentation on this hot wire machine knitting, and it's some kind of technique where they are using wire for medical devices and other sorts of things, and I was interested to see what they were doing. One of the things that I didn't expect when I walked into that room was that I would know like a third of the people in the room. I walked in, the president of the Machine Knitters Guild used to be a student of mine in knitting classes. There was a woman from the Hand Knitters Guild who was on the committee for our knitters retreat last year. She was there. And there was someone from my Wednesday knitting group there. I was like, just kept seeing all these people. It was so funny. And then just as I was sitting down, I think it was the woman who was on the retreat committee with me said, "Oh, do you know Amy?" And I look up, and this woman with bright blue hair reaches her hand out and says, "Oh, I think we have so much in common." And I was like, okay. And I looked at her name tag, and then I knew who she was. It was Amy Detyen. And she's a well-known knitting teacher in the Twin Cities area. She used to help Meg Swenson, who is Elizabeth Zimmerman's daughter, with the summer knitting camps that they do in Wisconsin every year. I don't know if Meg is still doing those or not, but Amy helps teach at those for years. So everybody, when that knew me, who saw me, and like, "Oh, what kind of knitting machine do you have?" I'm like, "I don't even know. I do own a knitting machine, but I was coming to the meeting because I wanted to see this hot wire machine knitting research stuff. And I wasn't even thinking about taking my knitting machine out again. It's been stored down in this room in the basement for almost 20 years. And they were all really encouraging me to try doing it again. And I have thought about it in the past. I've thought about how it could help speed up designing. Like if I have an idea for a stitch pattern, how's it going to work? If I could do it more quickly, just get my swatches and see if my idea is going to work, that might work. But one of the problems I had with machine knitting was kind of an issue I had with hand knitting too, which was I didn't know anybody when I was a hand knitter for the first 19 years, I didn't know any other knitters. And when I was machine knitting, I didn't know any other machine knitters. So, but obviously I walked into the Machine Knitters Guild meeting and I knew a lot of people, and they were really encouraging me to get started with it again. So, it might be something that I look into again this summer. It would be nice to do something with my machine, and rather than just have it sit and stored. So they were really encouraging me. So we'll see if I take it out and dip my toe into that again. I have so many sort of personal resources now, as well as one of the people there he and his mother run Rocking Horse yarn shop. It's outside the Twin Cities, but they do machine knitting, and they have machine knitting classes and get-togethers, and they do stuff with hand spinning and all kinds of stuff. They're really involved in both of the guilds. So that's nice to know that there are actual resources if I wanted to learn instead of bumbling my way through it on my own like I did previously. The presentation was really interesting. So this hot wire, what it is, it's wire that has memory, and just the chemical composition of it and the structure of it. When it's warmed up to a certain temperature, if you put it in a certain shape and you heat it up to a certain temperature, when it's in that shape, it will remember that shape. So then when you shape it put it in a different shape for some reason, like if you want to knit it, for example, then when you heat it up again, it will shift its shape. So one of the applications that it's being used for is like with airplane exhausts, where they can heat it up when they're closer to the ground, when they're coming in for landings, and that will dampen the sound and make it more tolerable to people in the area. But when it's high up in the air, it can be the shape can change so that it's bigger, it's louder, but no one can hear it up there, and it makes it more fuel efficient. So this graduate student that was talking to us, he had created, it was his first project that he wasn't even told what it was for at first, was to make a tire for the Mars rovers, because they had these steel wheels previous to that, and they would get dents in them, or they're cracked, or they break, and then it would render the rover useless. And so the idea is that these sort of knitted wire tires might get pushed out of shape as they are rolling over a rock, and it will kind of absorb the rock, but then it will want to put itself back into its original position, and it will shoot the rock out. They have various different applications for this, and so the wire is, one of the names for the wire is Flexol, I think, like flex. But it was just really interesting. It was passing around the sort of the knitted wire, and they had modified some knitting machines to help them create these things, and some of the knitting machines had broken. So the guy Jason, who sells knitting machines and parts and does repairs, is like, I can hook you up. I know how to get those things fixed. So it was really a fascinating thing, and it was really, I'm really glad I went. And I'm doubly glad I went because there were so many people there that I knew, encouraging me to try something that I've been kind of putting off for a long time, which is trying my knitting machine again. So this is the end of the second week of Finish It February. I didn't finish anything this week myself because as I've mentioned a couple times, I don't have that much personally to finish this particular February, but a number of you have in the Ravelry group been posting project after project that you've been finishing, or making that decision to frog it or get rid of it because you just don't like it. So that makes me feel great, because that's really the goal of Finish It February, is not just to finish things, but to just kind of address the things that are unfinished and decide whether or not that they are something that you actually do want to finish. I was at a knitting group last Saturday, and somebody was talking about a way of getting through UFOs that I thought was really interesting, and is potentially another option for those of you who are participating in Finish It February, but even if you're not, but you do have some UFOs that you'd like to find a way to complete. And the method that she had heard about was to pick 5 of your UFOs. Like if you have 15 of them or 20, just pick 5 of them, and you put them in a stack, and you pick up the top one, and you work on it for 12 hours. So 12 hours over however many days it takes you to knit for 12 hours. And then when you get to the end of that 12 hours, if you're not done with the project, you put it on the bottom of the stack, and then you take the next one. And if you want to, and then once you've completed one, then you get another one out of your UFO pile and put that one on the bottom. So that's a kind of thing that could still allow you to start new projects if you really wanted to as well. is that as you finish something, if you wanted to start something new, it just gets put into that rotation as well. So the idea is that it keeps things interesting. You don't get bored with things, and it keeps you, just gives you sort of a structured way of systematically working through your pile of UFOs. So if that's something that might work for you, you might be interested in that particular technique. So I mentioned I didn't finish anything this week. I did start something this week. I am going to be teaching at a knitting retreat at the end of April in western Wisconsin for a guild in the western Wisconsin area. And so we've been kind of nailing down exactly what the classes are that I'm going to be teaching for them. And we knew one of them was going to be a project class for twisted stitch patterns. And so we settled on a hat. I thought maybe fingerless mitts might be something, but we settled on a hat. And so I had a twisted stitch hat pattern that I'd used in the past, but it just has too many different elements, and I wanted something that was more of an introduction to twisted stitch patterns. And so this is the little hat that that I'm knitting up right now. And I'm gonna do a couple of different versions of it in different sizes, you know, so you can size up or down, or so that you can size up anyway. I'm looking forward to it. It should be a fun time. So that's what I'll be finishing up later tonight or tomorrow morning. So last week I was almost up to the underarms of my Roaring 20s sweater, and now I am at the underarms. I only had to work about 6 rows to get there. And so what I did this week was I did a mock-up of the sweater sleeve. I thought about using knitted fabric. I was trying to do that, and I didn't feel like it had the right heaviness to it. So what I decided to do instead was to knit up basically half of a sleeve, and so I could work out exactly how long I was going to need to make it. The way this sweater is constructed is that the actual knitting is done all in one piece. So I'm up to the armholes, and now what I have to do is cast on stitches for the entire length of the sleeve except for the little cuff. The entire length of the sleeve in both directions. So the pattern is constructed like this, so that you start here on the bottom of the back, and where I am right now is right here at the underarm. So I have to cast on stitches in both directions for the sleeves, and then you can see that these three little lines at each end. Those represent the slashes that will be in the sleeves. So the way the sleeve is kind of puffed at the bottom, and then there are these slits that are open. And what I needed to figure out was how long does the sleeve actually need to be in order to give me the right amount of puff. I wasn't sure if it needed to be the actual whole length of my arm, or if I only needed to go to the point where the cuff began. I really didn't know. So I was soliciting ideas from people that I knew who sewed to see if they had any theories. I was at the Knitters Guild meeting on Sunday. We had our annual tea, and my friend Elise was there, and she's also a quilter. And so I was showing her what the pattern looked like and what I was trying to figure out. I had decided at that point to knit this mock-up. And she had an interesting idea, which was, she said, well, when you're doing gathering of fabric, usually what you do is you want something that's twice as wide as you want it to be once it's gathered, and that produces a nice gathering. She's like, I wonder if that would be something similar, like you'd want to have it up a couple, you would want a couple of extra inches, or that you'd want it to move up by 2 inches if the slit was 5. Which is just the thought, and we were looking at it and trying to decide if that made sense, and we just weren't sure. So I knit the sleeve, which I will show you, which is right here. I will kind of slide it on my arm. So here's what the sleeve looks like. It has these slashes, and what I was trying to figure out is how long the sleeve needs to be in order for these to come out appropriately. And so what's going to happen, I have one of them right here, these will be crocheted around in order to keep them from rolling, because the bind off edge and the cast on edge want to roll. But what I figured out was that I probably don't need any extra length, that just the fact that this is bigger in circumference right here than the cuff is going to cause this to come out, and then the slashes are going to cause it to widen. So I decided to just knit it to the length of where the cuff starts, maybe slightly more. If I need it actually to end up being longer, I can end up making this cuff wider than it currently is in order to create more puff. But I was able to get that resolved. This wasn't something that I wanted to try and then rip out, and I'm still nervous that I haven't quite figured it out correctly. But I'm more convinced that I'm right. And what I figured out was that my sleeves need to be 3 inches longer than what the pattern specified. I think the model in that pattern was like 5 feet tall, because I was surprised that I had to add 3 inches to the length based on where it was hitting her on her hips. I thought, geez, why is that? And the arms are so much shorter as well. I think she was just a tiny, tiny woman that they knit that sweater for. If I knit it as it was written, it would have been like a crop sweater with 3/4 length sleeves. It never would have fit me at all. So a couple of weekends ago, I got online and I started ordering vintage knitting manuals. I had been on the lookout for vintage knitting manuals since I started knitting vintage and antique sweater patterns. I was able to find a lot of digitized ones from the 19th century, but I really wanted some from the 20th century, like from 1900, into mid-century. I really was interested in that because I had noticed as I was knitting these sweaters that the techniques that were used were a lot of the same techniques that we use today, but they often use them in different ways. And I also noticed that there were certain techniques where there was a pretty standard way of knitting them, like with the short rows. They didn't have 9 million different ways of doing short rows. They turned and slipped a stitch. That was what they did. And I was really interested in seeing how that may have progressed through the 20th century. Like, when did things turn into wrap and turn, for example? When did they start doing that? Another thing I was interested in is how they were treating the selvages when they were knitting flat, and how they were seaming, because it was pretty clear that in the 19th century you slipped the first stitch of every row, and when you seamed, you used backstitch. So slipping a stitch in that situation, if you're going to use backstitch, which was just like the standard way of seaming things, even for woven fabrics, that slipping the stitch would make the seam less bulky, and it would make it, kind of easier to line things up as you were seaming to make sure that you were getting your rows lined up. It would just make that process easier. And I was wondering, well, when did they start using mattress stitch, and what did they call it? And so sometimes I think they were calling it woven stitch, although I'm not completely sure that woven stitch was really the same thing as mattress stitch either. But so that's one of the things I'm looking for in these books, decade by decade. What are they recommending as best practices versus what are we doing today when we recommend how to do things? So I think I ordered 11 books, and so far I think I've gotten 4 or 5 of them. 1, 2, 4. I've gotten 5 of them. So I thought I'd share one book per week and just talk about what's in these particular books and what they say about techniques. But some of them have patterns in them too. Some of them have stitch patterns, some of them have actual garment patterns and various things. So the first one is the Columbia Manual of Knitting and Crochet. I was interested in getting this because the first vintage sweater I met was from the Columbia Book of Yarns. So Columbia was a yarn company that formed somewhere in the 19th century, I believe, after the Civil War. So there were, in the United States, there were some big yarn companies like Columbia, Minerva, Fleischers, and they all produced pattern books and along with their yarns. So this is a book that was published in 1936. It's mostly a stitch dictionary, so if you have any of Barbara Walker's treasuries, they'll kind of look familiar, except that they tend to have one pattern per page, and they have a lot of spacing between the lines here. But they have all kinds of different textured stitch patterns, which are really, really interesting. At the back of the book, they have information about sample measurement charts. And so they have different sizes, and like for a skirt, and showing you how big the waist is and how long it is for different sizes, as well as things like for sweaters and for sleeves and stuff like that. And with, you know, information about making sure that you adjust it for the person's actual body. Like you might have a stout woman who's very short versus a tall person who's, you know, very skinny, but it gives you a sense of how they were proportioning their garments back then. And I don't know if it was this book, but I think it was this book where they talked about if you're using a paper pattern for knitting things. And I thought that was a really interesting concept, because somebody else had mentioned that the other day, that their relatives had all learned to knit or something in Wales or England or something, you know, decades ago. And they couldn't read patterns, knitting patterns, but they would use paper patterns. And so they would knit things according to the shape, and that their grandmother or somebody had like basically like a full-size schematic of a sweater, and then all of the notes written on there for how many stitches to cast on, what needles to use, and all that. And I thought that's such an interesting way of doing that. In some ways it's like, oh, that's obvious, but it wasn't obvious. It's not obvious to me. I never would have thought to do that, but it makes total sense. And at the beginning of the book, they have techniques for things like doing bust darts, a short row shoulder shaping. They've got things for repairing stockinette stitch, you know, how you cut out the stitches that are bad, and then setting up the weaving so that you can then do the duplicate stitch. This was really interesting to me. And so again, the short row shaping is just turn and slip a stitch, although there was something in here that said if you slip the stitch through the back, that makes it tighter. So that was pretty interesting to me. Increasing is always knit front back, but here's what I think is interesting. They did not say to slip the selvage stitch. They were explicitly stated to knit the selvage stitches to make seaming easier. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm wondering if they meant garter stitch, like if they meant actually the knit stitch on front and back, or if they were using knit in terms of the generic just knitting. But they specifically said to knit the stitches to make seaming easier rather than using selvage stitch. And then the way that they are describing seaming is to catch one thread from each side. And it's not clear to me what thread they're talking about. If they're talking about a leg of the stitch, if they're talking about the running thread between stitches, it's not really clear. But they do have some information about picking up stitches for a sleeve. So if you've ever done sleeves from the top down where you picked up stitches all the way around the armhole, and then you did short row shaping back and forth to form the sleeve cap, this is kind of interesting. What you'll see is right here, what they're doing is a short row sleeve cap, but they're picking up stitches and doing the short rows at the same time, back and forth. They start out by picking up, say, 2 inches at the start of the cap, and then they go 3 inches or 3 stitches beyond there, 3 stitches back the other way. And it's really interesting, and they're explaining how to pick up stitches for garter stitch versus stockinette. And the way they're describing it, when I look at the photograph, it's not a very neat join. And so I would like to do an experiment where I try on a swatch their method versus how we would do it today, and then see and compare it to how we would pick up stitches today, but then also compare it to the method where you pick up all the way around the armhole and then do your short row shaping. So it'd be interesting. It's fascinating to me to see that they're talking about doing sleeves this way. It's really amazing, and this is exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping to see and learn in these old knitting manuals. Oh, one of the other things that I thought was really interesting was that they were talking, the things that they said about binding off. First of all, they said you should always bind off on the purl side. And they said this makes for a firmer and neater seams, and it makes for a very pleasing look if you're doing something like a scarf. And it almost sounds to me like they're not binding off in pattern. Like they're on the purl side and they're binding off knitting instead of in pattern. And then they describe 3 ways of binding off. For a tight edge, knit off the back strand of each stitch. A tight edge is particularly good for a ribbed border or cuff, which I disagree. 2, for a medium edge, knit off the front strand of one stitch and the back strand of the next. And for a loose edge, knit off the front strand of all stitches. This is practical where the edge is to be picked up for a knitted or crocheted border. And then they said when binding off, the majority of workers should use needles 1 or 2 sizes larger than those used in the body of the work. This is to prevent the edge from drawing. So I don't want you to pull in. So on the one hand, they don't want it to be tight, but on the other hand, they're telling you how to make it tight. So it's just an interesting thing, and I think I'm going to do some comparisons of what they were saying then to do versus what we would likely do today. You never know. Sometimes I make an assumption that, well, that's a bad idea, and then I'll try it out and I'll think, oh, well, that's not so bad after all. So a lot of the books that I ordered were from a series of books that were written by 2 women named Jane Coster and Margaret Murray. They were published by Odom's Press in the UK. The first book was published in 1940. It was called Practical Knitting Illustrated. And this is the cover of that. This book apparently was wildly popular, and it was reprinted numerous times in the 1940s. So these 2 women published a knitting book almost every year during the 1940s. I think there was one year in the middle of the 40s where they didn't publish one. It would have been right in the war. And then, so between 1940 and 1948 or 9, they published 8 books for Odom's Press. I thought that was like incredibly prolific of them, and I wondered if they were real people, because I thought, how could they produce, because these are patterns. So these aren't just like a Stitch Dictionary thing like the Columbia one. These are patterns for all kinds of things. It's got garments for people, and it's got pillows and shawls and scarves and all kinds of things in here. So I began wondering if these were real women or not, and I started Googling around, and I found a blog post from someone who has, I think, the whole series of these books. And she mentioned that they were mentioned in Richard Rutt's book on the history of hand knitting. So that is this book right here. And this is a really amazing book. It's probably the first really academic look at hand knitting and the history of it, and where the research was thoroughly done with sources, and he actually went and physically looked at a lot of the specimens that he talked about. But he was talking about influential knitters, and this is mostly a history of hand knitting in England or in the UK, not so much United States. And he mentioned these 2 women, and he actually told something about them. So they were real women. They were sisters-in-law. One of them married the other one's brother, and they had apparently started a child modeling agency at first, and then they started publishing these knitting patterns. And so they were with Odom's Press for like the 40s, and then they broke off with them, and Odom's tried to publish additional knitting books like their books in similar format, not successful. But these 2 women went on to write patterns for like all of the different yarn companies in the UK, and they wrote other books, and they were really prolific. So now that I know more that first of all they were real, I have a list of some other places to look for their work in the 50s and even into the 60s. At least one of them continued publishing into the 60s. So that was a fascinating thing to find out. I do wonder though if they had a staff, because even some of the really big name designers who actually went to design school, and they design things, and they know what the stitch patterns are going to be. They don't necessarily write the patterns up for the knitters, and the technical editors might do a lot of that, and then they'll have sample knitters. So these big name designers may have staffs who do a lot of the other work for them. So I wonder if they had help, because I just can't imagine creating this volume of work every year. But maybe they did. I sometimes wonder how Barbara Walker did it. She did all those treasuries like practically every year in the 70s, along with other books on knitting from the top, and she's inventing all of this stuff. And I just wonder if these women ever slept. How did they do that? I would love to know. I wanted to update you on some of the information that I was talking about last week when it came to vintage yarns. I had decided that the term zephyr meant yarns were woolen spun. But as I was doing some searching around for other types of yarn to try to figure out what they meant, I came across a book. It was the Dictionary of Textiles, and it was published in 2015. It's on Google Books, and it said 8th edition, and then there was a big like starburst on the cover that said 100th anniversary edition. And it had terms in there that go all the way back to, to 19th century, maybe earlier. And it describes different things that relate to textile, all the vocabulary. So that, the idea is that if you're trying to recreate some kind of textile from another century, that you will understand what that kind of textile was. So I started looking up all of these different types of yarns and realized that many of them were actually merino wools. Like Berlin, Spanish yarn, Zephyr originally was a merino yarn. In the 20th century in the United States, Zephyr came to mean soft spun yarn that had a micron count below whatever, 64 or something. So in the mid-century, as synthetic fibers became in use more and more, Zephyr yarns might have been some kind of a blend. It might have been completely synthetic. It just meant it was soft. But originally, it meant that it was merino. And I started thinking about that, like all of these different yarns, Berlin, Botany, Andalusian, Spanish, they were all Zephyr. They were all merino yarns. And I started thinking about that a little more, and I merino wool was first bred in Spain, and it was the first sheep that was bred specifically for its fleece and not, a dual purpose sheep, and meat and fleece. And they were forbidden from being exported out of Spain. So Spain had the lock on really fine, beautiful fiber yarn. Wool yarn. In 1765, I believe it was, the King of Spain made a gift of some merino sheep to France and also to somewhere that is now Germany, but Germany wasn't Germany then, but a gift to France and a gift to Germany. And so they began raising merino sheep in those areas too. So Spanish yarn was a merino yarn, and I think it indicated particular yarn weight as well, particular type of twist to the spin, to the yarn, maybe how thin it was. Andalusian was a term that they used mostly in Great Britain for Spanish yarn. It wasn't a term that we used too much here in the U.S. Berlin yarn also. Berlin wool was a particular yarn that was developed for needlework. But it was also knitting yarn. Botany was from Botany Bay in Australia, also merino wool. So that was really interesting to me. All these things that were names of things referred to the fact that they were where they're from and that they were merino. And then in addition, I think there was some kind of indication of how thick or other qualities of the yarn that I don't yet know. But as I was looking all of this up in this Dictionary of Textiles, I started thinking about, well, this is the 100th anniversary edition. That means the first one was probably about 1915, which would have been when all of this vintage stuff was going on. And it would be interesting to see the first edition book, and it would be in the public domain because it would be before the 1920s. So I found a copy of it on, well, there's multiple copies on archive.org, which I'll leave links to down below. And it has a lot of the same content. And so as the editions are revised over time, they might, change what something means now, like Zephyr. That definition was gradually changed over the course of the century. But a lot of the stuff still points back to the original usages of the 19th century, which is very helpful. One place where things got more confusing, though, was in the definition of what Germantown yarn was. And they said typically four-ply yarn, which I knew. They called it a slack twist woolen yarn. They didn't say worsted, they said woolen, and that confused me because I had figured out that Zephyr actually wasn't a woolen spun. It actually was worsted spun, and it was merino. So I thought, oh, well, that's the difference between fourfold Germantown and fourfold Germantown Zephyr, is that one was a softer yarn. But then it was saying that Germantown was woolen spun, and I'm not seeing any contemporary descriptions of the historical yarn that indicates that it was woolen spun. But there's a lot of confusion in some of the history that I'm reading about Germantown wool, because they'll use the term worsted, but Germantown wool was a worsted weight wool. So when they were talking about, oh, it was the most popular worsted yarn out there, worsted weight, worsted spun, not clear. There's a mill currently, Kilbourne Mills, began producing a Germantown wool a few years ago, and their goal was to replicate the old Brunswick Germantown yarn, which was a more contemporary version of Germantown wool, but it's hard to know what it originally was or what it was 100 years ago, and whether woolen yarn described what Germantown yarn was before the Civil War or after the Civil War, when things got a lot more mechanized. It's really not clear. So I'm still digging into figuring out what Germantown wool was. So I'm still on a quest to understand fully what Shetland floss was and how that was related to Shetland wool or Shetland yarn of other types. And I even, at somebody's suggestion, I contacted the Shetland Textile Museum, and they weren't even sure. They're still trying to figure out what that means. I did find a definition of Shetland floss and Shetland yarn in this Practical Knitting Illustrated book that was published in 1940. And what they say was that Shetland floss was a rather hairy yarn, loosely spun in two-ply. It is used for such things as shawls and bed jackets, while Shetland yarn, this yarn can be as fine as human hair when it is used for making the exquisite shawls for which the Shetlands are famous. In two-ply, three-ply, and four-ply, it knits up into hard-wearing garments of first-class quality. So I don't know what that means. And they're not sure yet either. So I'm hoping that somebody there will be able to shed some light on this whole Shetland floss thing. And why is it that it was so common, like 50 to 100 years ago, or maybe 70 to 100 years ago, and we don't have any idea what it is now? I really wonder. It's kind of a mystery. But I'll keep looking. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.